So the main question for the next few slides are like, why should we care? Why is research on sexual and gender minority populations important? I mean, if we don't know how many of them are out there, we can't count them, we can't do any research. So actually knowing the size of these populations is vital to actually doing this. If we don't have the data, we can't do anything. And if we don't have reliable data or valid data collection tools, again, it's still not that great. If we're not asking the right questions about sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, then we're not going to be able to do anything with the data because it's going to be bad quality. So some people have done better jobs than others. There is some data out there, but basically due to the poor and inconsistent data collection that's been out there, especially in larger data sets, we don't really know how many sexual and gender minority population or individuals are out there. And we don't know how many have been miscategorized because their identity isn't being reflected in the limited options that are being shown. So again, why do we care? This and the next slide are basically showing the image that I like to talk about a lot, where America is getting gayer. Like more people are identified sexual and gender minority spectrum. You can see the numbers are going up here in this sample from Gallup of how many LGBT individuals are in the United States. And in some of our own work, looking within the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, look how the rates of bisexual, lesbian, gay, and not sure individuals are increasing within this high school sample of youth over time. And it's not just that more people are identifying as gay or a sexual minority, but it's also that people feel more comfortable coming out. There's less stigma around it. So there could be the same number of people who identify as sexual or gender minorities as there were 10, 20, 50 years ago, but they just feel more comfortable coming out about it. That's something we're probably never going to know, but collecting good data will help us figure that out in the future. So as some of what Michelle already presented, there's a ton of health disparities within these populations. So sexual and gender minority individuals, Is that better? Yeah. They don't just have health issues, so mental health, HIV, substance use, diabetes, but they also have these other indicators of like poor well-being. So they have poor family support, they lack housing, they lack good education, good access to resources that can actually support like being successful in whatever they want to do with their lives. And they experience a lot of victimization from the community, from their parents, from their partners. And all of this causes this whole big problem that causes really bad health disparities. And we talk a lot about the way they're parameterized. So why are we seeing health disparities? Minority stress is a big one. So it has traditionally been applied to like racial ethnic minority populations. It's basically the theory that you're exposed to racism or hatred in the community, your body gets stressed out about it, and you deal with it by using drugs or being depressed or seeking poor coping behaviors that lead to these negative outcomes. This has been translated into a lot of work now that's focused on the way that minority stress affects sexual and gender minority populations, because homophobia, transphobia, biphobia are all things that have similar impacts on people as these other problems. Social determinants of health. So as Yeshi and some other people indicated, it's not just your individual behavior. It's like living in poverty, living in a community that doesn't accept you, living in a place where being gay could get you killed or imprisoned. Like that has a huge impact on what kinds of health disparities you have. Then you also have people being unable to measure these things in countries like Nigeria or other countries in Africa where you can get killed or imprisoned for being gay. So who's going to answer those questions in a survey? Stigma, individual people have their own internalized homophobia. There's community level stigma for a number of different conditions. You might overcome homophobia and people are very accepting of gay populations, but then are they also accepting of bisexuals or ace people? Like, there's always some population that is still going to be facing stigma regardless of how well we're doing. And then policies that affect the larger picture. I mean, we had been doing great in the United States. Now we're going backwards. These policies are really affecting all of the positive outcomes we were seeing in the population, trending towards better health outcomes, better mental health, fewer suicides. Having all these policies that are very like transphobic and anti-gay, anti-LGBT in general are really having these big impacts. And this is an example of just like the multi-level factors that are associated with this that Dylan put together for me for one of my projects. It just shows there's so many factors that go into what's causing this. And it's hard to get data on one or two of these things for a marginalized population. And we need to leverage things such as big data to actually be able to talk more about these, because it's hard to do a huge survey of 100,000 gay people in the United States. So why do we need better data? So this is a little bit what I've covered. So data we have is fine for places that capture it. It might not be the best, but we have some data. It might not capture like all of the different identities, all the different intersections of identities, but it's a place to start. And collecting this data in different situations is really helpful for understanding this. So one key place that I think this has really come up is in the area of chronic diseases. We think a lot about asking about sexual identity behavior in HIV studies, but no one really thinks about how your sexual identity affects your like cardiovascular risk. And having to go through convincing researchers who do that work that we actually need to collect this data and it's actually useful is a big problem, because they don't know why that would matter over like poor diet or something, but research shows it does, and not collecting the data on that isn't helping us see if it actually matters. So just giving a little bit about the definitions, since I know a lot of people in this room are familiar with these, but not everyone is, to make sure we're all on the same page. Sexual orientation has three different aspects. You have identity, attraction, and behavior. So identity is one's internal sense of self. I have examples of some of these questions for each of these. I wouldn't say these are the best options. These are just ones we've pulled from different surveys just to give you an example of what a survey question could look like. These are not definitive. There's not a strict definition for them. People aren't stuck at a single identity in time. People's identities change over time, as we see a lot, especially in adolescence, as identity develops. And it also fails to capture information on all of the aspects of sexual orientation. It doesn't capture behavior, it doesn't capture attraction. One of the weaknesses with the current data is that there's so many labels, people try to compress them, and you have to walk the line between getting data that you can actually use and dealing with like 50 response options or an open-ended question, which is nearly impossible to use. Another thing that we often see is that people have multiple identities, especially within some of the work we've done in the asexual community. There's a lot of overlapping identities, and most of these questions are only choose one. And if you are asexual and bisexual, how do you choose which one? And whichever one you choose isn't going to be an accurate reflection of you. So you're missing out on that nuance. Attraction is one that's less measured because it's usually seen as less pertinent to a lot of the health work. So behavior, obviously, for sexual transmission of diseases, identity more for like your sense of self and how it affects your mental health. Attraction is really looking at how people identify the people that they are romantically or sexually attracted to. Again, this comes back to things like asexuals who could be attracted to people or may not be attracted to people, but the best way to measure asexuality, aside from asking about it, is if there's an absence of sexual attraction. Again, this is one scale. This is, again, not the best because it uses the binary for the gender, but it's one scale that has been used in one of the few scales that actually capture this I don't experience sexual attraction to look at asexual population. And finally, behavior, which is probably the one that people who are in the HIV drug use field understand the most, where you're asking about who you have sex with. So basically, we want to know what genitalia you have, what genitalia your partner have, and how you use it. But no one feels comfortable narrowing it down to that strict definition. So you ask, if you have sex with a woman, but what does a woman mean? And what does sex mean? And you miss out on a lot of these key features when you're only looking at what you think their perceived gender is and not looking at what things are interacting during the sexual encounter. And again, here's a question. This is from the YRBS. It's another not great question, but one measure of sexual behavior. So here's an example of someone's identity for their orientation for their identity, attraction, behavior. So you have someone who identifies as bisexual, their attraction is asexual, and they have never had sex. If you only capture one of these items, you miss out on these other identities. And again, you're missing out on things if you're not collecting the data the right way. So how do sexual identity behavior intersect? You might say, well, probably people who say they're gay only have sex with people of the same sex. That's not necessarily true. This is a figure from one of our YRBS studies where you can see that that's not true. So the gray over here is everyone who identified as heterosexual and who had sex with people of a different gender only. You can see there's about 5% who said they're heterosexual but still had sex with someone of the same sex. So if you don't ask about sexual behavior, you're missing out on those sexual minority populations. Similarly, you can see that there are a number of people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, not sure, who've only had sex with people of the opposite gender, who, if you only focus on behavior, would be classified as a sexual majority. And by only using one of these measures, you miss out on a lot of this nuance. And you can see there's about a decent amount of people here who would be misclassified without using both of these measures. I'll go a little bit more into that best practices, but I want to go through sex and gender just because those are the last two pieces of the SOGI. Sex is basically taken to be what you were medically assigned at birth. Generally, people use the binary for male and female, but that tends to erase people who are intersex or who have indeterminate sex characteristics at birth. Also, people who identify as transgender may often change their legal sex. So you can't just use sex as a blanket term. You have sex assigned at birth, you have legal sex, and even that gets complicated. See, like this is a question you almost always see, and this is the question from YRBS, and this tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you, is this your sex assigned at birth? Is this your legal sex? Are they equating sex and gender? And that's a big challenge we've had in trying to interpret these data. And then gender, similar to sexual orientation, has different aspects. You have gender identity. Again, that's your internal sense of self. It may or may not align with your gender expression. It doesn't have to. Expression is how you present to the world. So this is the pronouns you use. Like everyone has their pronoun buttons, hopefully, to identify how you express yourself to the world might not align with how you look or act, or it could. It doesn't matter. It's how you want to identify. Again, a lot of health surveys often conflate a lot of these terms together. There's at least one survey I've seen where transgender is listed as a sexual orientation. And that's problematic for so many reasons. And because of that and all these other reasons, like the data we have, while it's great to actually have that data, isn't the greatest data. Even within this transgender umbrella, there's different categories. So I won't necessarily go through all of these, but like the three major categories under transgender are like transgender, so people whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex assigned at birth, non-binary for people who don't identify as either male or female, and then gender non-conforming, who it tends to explain their gender expression a bit better than their identity, but it's also someone whose what they identify doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth. So again, another thing I'm not going to go through, but this is the table we have of different federal surveys that actually collect data on some aspect of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So the American Community Survey or the census, it collects not good sexual orientation data. Basically, you have to use the data from number of same-sex headed households as an indicator of like prevalence of gay people in the community, which is awful, but the best you have with the census. Behavioral risk factor surveillance has a variety of different questions. There's a number of issues with how things were assessed within that. So a lot of these have some of these questions, but no one has everything and no one measures it the same way, and that's a huge problem. So here you can see only 19% of these data sources measure transgender inclusive gender identity. So there's a best practices model that's been developed by Sari Reisner and others. That's a two-step question to assess sex assigned at birth and gender identity to really make sure people understand what the question is saying and they answer it in a way that reflects their identity. Most of these 19% didn't include that just because two questions takes more time than one question. And we've seen in some of these surveys, people are like, there aren't that many people identify as transgender, so why should we collect that data and waste our time adding a second question? 40% of sources only measure a single dimension of sexual orientation. So like I said before, this limits what we know about the different dimensions of sexual orientation. Only 14% of them follow the best practices to recommend all three, so you have the behavior, attraction, and identity measures. Again, only one survey assesses asexuality, so that remains very unknown and understudied. And like I just said, like things are improving, but nothing's standardized, nothing's really great or comparable, and it's a huge challenge to do this work when you're trying to work with these data sets. So one of the studies that Michelle mentioned I have is NIAAA funding to really look at these health disparities within the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a CDC biennial survey that collects data from high school youth. And we're looking at alcohol and HIV risk behavior differences between sexual minority and sexual majority youth. But even though this is it's like the largest data set of high school age youth in the United States, and there's so much you can do with it, we're limited by poor data questions that are in there. So that sex question that just said, what is your sex, male or female, that causes issues because we don't know what that means. And with the latest round of YRBS, they had questions about gender identity, gender expression. We don't know how to interpret those based on the sex questions because we don't know how the students interpreted the sex questions. So we're in this weird place where we can say what sex they said, we can say what, whether they are primarily express female characteristics or whatever, but we don't know if their sex is interpreted as gender or sex assigned at birth, and that causes challenges. There's also limited sexual orientation options. So they only ask if you're heterosexual or straight, gay or lesbian, bisexual, or not sure. And you can only choose one, and that's not very all-encompassing, especially for youth, where we know a lot of these newer terms are being more widely used, like pansexual and queer, and those people, we don't know how they're classifying themselves. So we can look at intersecting minority status within this data set, but it's not the best. I mean, these are just some examples of work we've done. We've really been focused on the intersections of identity and behavior because we can look at that and to really tell people why they need to be collecting these. Because, again, people tend to only look at one dimension, and you're really limited within these data sets. I think the middle paper is our biggest one just because we did a deep dive into the overlap between identity and behavior, and surprisingly, there's not a lot of people. There's a lot of people who don't have a sexual identity that you would think would match with their behavior because a lot of people aren't having sex at this age, so they're not going to have sexual behavior that identifies them as a sexual minority. So there's lots of different issues you need to take into account when you're working with these data. But the fact that YRBS included these questions on gender identity and gender expression was a huge deal because it's the first time it's been collected at this wide scale, and it's gotten a lot of attention. This is a MMWR report that came out in 2017 to really look at the data, and it was one of the first of its kind. You can see almost 2% of high school students identify as transgender. That goes against people saying nobody's going to respond to this question. There's not enough reason to add this question. But without adding these questions, we would never be able to do this. So some conclusions. Data systems often miss the sexual orientation and gender identity questions. Even those that include the questions don't always get it right. People are left out in the process. You miss out on these understudied populations. So asexual populations, intersex populations, transgender populations, all of these that are smaller populations that aren't within the normal questions people ask are pretty much erased from data collection, and you don't know anything about their health disparities because you don't have data on them. And also, a lot of people tend to group categories together, which has traditionally been done for power, but in these larger data sets, you don't need to do that. So YRBS, we have a data set with 700,000 people in it. There's no reason for us to collapse lesbian, gay, and bisexual into one category, but people still do that. And you miss the nuance of health disparities that bisexuals face that lesbian, gay populations don't. And we think it's really important to be sure to break out data as much as you can. But we still get reviewers who tell us, why didn't you collapse these into a sexual minority category, even though that was the whole point of doing it. So I think the way I want to end this is just that we have been struggling with this a lot. We are trying to get funding to actually standardize these measures. We're hoping to get some news about a grant soon, but that we are going to be doing really community engaged work, working directly with especially the understudied populations, the asexual, intersex groups, to figure out how data has been collected in electronic medical records, in federal health surveys, in cohort studies, in surveillance data, everything you can think of to see how it's been done, come up with a comprehensive question set, go to the community, go through the questions, get their feedback on what makes sense, what doesn't, with a special focus on different categories. Do people who are under 20 need a different set of questions than people over 50? Try to figure out what best practices are, and then pilot test this against what has been used in the past just to see how well does this perform against what's been done and how can we improve things. And it's important to do this because people are doing whatever they want and we can't compare things. So I really hope that one of the things that comes out of this is more passion around trying to standardize measures and try to collect data in a way that's community informed and community responsive.
Why don't we do a little bit of Q&A before we shift over to Lauren's presentation in the back?
Thank you so much. This was a really good presentation. One thing I'm really interested in brought up so many examples of so many places, especially around gender identified
Right.
people. What do you do with that data? Like, how can you still use that and make it usable, presented to the community? I'm just really interested in how you do that, especially you talked a little bit about generation.
Yeah.
It's like a really interesting variable. So
I mean, it's a struggle. You have limited population level data sets to work with, and like we've been talking with like the people at CDC who run the YRBS, and it's like it takes forever for them to change questions, and it's almost like you have to do the work yourself, and you don't end up with these big data sets or these population level data sets, and it's a big struggle. There's not a good solution, really. Like, I would love if there was something we could do, but like the fact that YRBS included these gender identity and expression questions was amazing. The fact that the national YRBS included sexual behavior and sexual identity questions in 2015 was amazing, but that took many years of work and still ended up with bad questions included. So it's like trying to figure out how much you're willing to give in to be like, is it better to have bad questions and no questions? And how do we deal with the bad questions in order to leverage the lack of data to find other ways to get more data?
And I think there's a lot of history of asking ethnographic and demographic questions, even quite recently around race, ethnicity, primary language. And it's interesting, I worked on that a long time ago, and I still see people needing to understand how to ask those questions or why things are put into certain buckets if they are that I'm not going to talk about if I agree with them or not. And so I think what's so fascinating is now when I hear that people kind of feel that they have that under their belt, which they oftentimes still don't, to then introduce added questions around demographics and things like that. It's been really interesting, kind of some of the pushback, or I don't understand why you're asking, like it's such similar response to 10 years ago. So I think being able to, I know we're not comparing apples to apples, but I think we're in the same fruit bowl.
Yeah.
No pun intended,
And I mean, like one of our big critiques has always been like, how are straight cisgender people going to react to these questions? And it's like, like, how do you deal with that? So like, people who are in those categories don't always understand these questions. And it's like the same, like you have people who are white and you ask them, are you Hispanic, and have no idea what that means. Yes.
Was the idea that it's hard to imagine that these things are going to remain static, right? That there is over time the question that the words chosen for identifying yourself, either ethnically or sexually, will change. And is there a way to kind of hardwire the kind of evolution of the system in which you, besides asking questions, you give the option to say something else that you actually could monitor and could be used to sort of modify in an automated way? I just think that kind of every time you have to go and lobby for the damn thing to be changed, we are always kind of running behind what the knowledge and the culture is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a big struggle in, like, even, like, bisexual, like, there are people who don't like that term, and it's, like, trying to figure out how to best collect it, and having, like, a not listed option where people write it in is a huge pain in the ass, but it's, like, the best way to get data. Like, it's going to take a whole ton of work to clean that, but that tends to be the best way to get accurate and correct data on people.
Yeah, like there's about age. Like if you just ask someone their age, they're not as likely to answer that question as they are if you give them ranges, because then they don't feel like they're really telling you that they're 42, but they're letting you know they're somewhere between 35 and 45 or something. So it's interesting too how, but I mean this is what's so fascinating though, that is not similar to all of the other things. Your race, ethnicity. So I think the other thing is not only standardizing, being thoughtful of the question, but how frequently ask the question, collect the data.
Right, especially in longitudinal studies, you ask race at baseline, and then
chances are they're still white.
Right, you assume that's not going to change, but you never know with gender or sexual orientation or behavior or anything. And I think another thing with this talk is like we put some of this together. So Dylan helped with a workshop we gave to the American Evaluation Association, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds and different experiences like really thought how hard this was to incorporate this into anything, like even a simple evaluation, like doing this is hard. So just thinking about how to like incorporate standardized questions into federal surveys is like never even crossed their mind because they just thought it was impossible.
Dr. Phillips, thank you. I want to, Sarah's pointing out some really good facts here, and that, you know, we use this term trisexual and metasexuals, try anything meta, I got to have more than one. So it doesn't necessarily just germane itself to a so-called heterosexual, or I don't like that term cisgen because I don't have no cis nowhere, but I get what they mean. But a person that may have had multiple partners, but doesn't mean that their sexuality or attraction is just one aspect of things, that they identify as a total person.
Right.
So I'm going to challenge you on a question and just say, why do you want to standardize it? Aren't we moving to getting away from big data and to just let people say who they are? Because this is for resources, or why do you really? I mean, in this case, you're talking about youth. Are they going to get more benefits? Is this for school? I mean, want to standardize it. So the YRB is asking these questions, but is it to increase their health outcome? Let them just say who they are.
I mean, yeah, that's a valid point. Like, we hope that they use this for a policy change, but who knows how the data are being used. It's probably the trend is they stick it in MMWR and see it again for a decade. I mean, my thoughts for standardization is like, I like people to say whatever they want. Like, I don't want to force people into categories or force them to respond to a question if it doesn't make sense to them. But it also limits our ability to be able to look at things across systems. If we don't know, if we ask different questions for youth as we do to adults, then we don't know anything about how health disparities we see in youth are appearing in adults. We don't know, like, if we include items for youth, like if we include asexual for youth but not for adults, then we don't know what happens once they become adults. So I think there are lots of problems with standardizing questions when they're so nuanced, but it's also so important to be able to look across data sets and across different cohort studies and across different electronic medical record systems, just so that there's some sort of comparison ability. Because if we ask questions differently in Chicago than we do in Detroit, again, we don't know what that means. And if we don't have that, I mean, I would love if we could ask lots of questions that we could have, like a standardized one and just an open-ended one, but like people aren't going to do that. But like I would love it if we had like the one that we would use for a comparison and the one that we use for them to say what they feel. Like I've seen some examples of it where people are like, this is like the way I identify, and then there's the follow-up questions like, if you had to choose one of these categories, what would you choose, just to like get something that you can use in data analysis. But
when I say benefits, it's like in surveillance for HIV, which you already know.
Yeah.
Chicago was one of the first health departments to put in transgender on their surveillance forms. I'm out of surveillance now. But the other part of this is that came from pushback from our community constituents who were transgender, felt like they weren't being talked about or heard because they weren't getting treatment. So when I say benefits and when I talked about what do the youth get, it's not the same as a disease illness benefit.
Mhm.
It's more of a social benefit. I don't know.
Well,
Michelle,
one thing I just wanted to point. Sorry. Yeah. What this brought up for me too is thinking about like when we're able to standardize these items and include them at scale in these federal surveys, we can actually start looking at some of these structural things that maybe when you have smaller data sets, you don't have the same ability. So what I'm thinking of is like in national data sets like YRBS, you can look at state level local policies and start to look at differences among states in health outcomes of these kids. And we have some papers on that, you know, trying to look at differences by state and like how this has affected things like suicide and, you know, specifically in LGBT kids. I mean, so there's absolute benefits in being able to do things at scale. You know, you can start to ask bigger questions in a lot of ways and have a little bit more ability to have confidence in the reliability of the data that you're using. But yes, it also comes at a cost too.
I was studying this quarter with a professor who had kind of figured out how to reverse codify. It was mostly ethnography studies, ethnographic studies. And so I'm wondering if maybe we're kind of going at it the same way we ask other people of privilege to not go at it, where we're saying, okay, in my head, this is what it means to be transgender or whatever, and so I'm going to set forth the criteria for how that question should be answered, and maybe doing something more of a study that's like going to people who might fit into these different categories and asking them to describe what it means for them to be in these three categories of behavior, attraction, and I think the first one was, you know, part of sexuality. So like if we ask them, what are these, how do you perceive yourself in these three places, and then reverse codify what they're coming up with, and sort of compare and contrast and see if there's a pattern, rather than saying, all right, let's go up from the front end and then see if people are going to answer the questions from the back. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Right. I mean, that's exactly the way we're thinking. We're putting together like key informant interviews and focus groups with all these stratifications with asexual individuals, intersex individuals, older individuals, people in the South, people in the rural areas, just to get how they identify their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their sex. And yeah, part of it's going to be showing them how it's been collected in the past, but part of it's also having this conversation of like, how do you identify yourself? Like, how would you respond in a survey? Like, what terms would you use? Because I'm not a member of many of these communities. Like, I'm not the one that should be determining this. It should be the people who are of the communities that we're studying that should be telling me how to appropriately measure this.
I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but you were talking and I just had an idea, which is another aspect of it, which is how you present to society or how you want to be identified by society. You know, especially in places where there is that are not welcoming to any kind of differences. But if there was some guarantee that the organization asking the questions would keep anonymity, it would be interesting to see to what extent there is also, because that could be a different aspect of things, right?
Right.
If you want to have your true identity remain hidden, wouldn't that also be an interesting thing to find out?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working with someone trying to figure out how to potentially ask people in Nigeria if they have had sex with men in a way that we could collect that data and actually know if they are engaging in that behavior. And it's like finding the right people who are embedded in the community who are able to do that. And it's like so much nuance that goes into it in those contexts. But yeah, there's a lot of people who, like, especially in those communities, who say they're straight, who have a wife, but also have sex with men because, like, it's illegal and they have to do it underground. And it's like, that's another reason why all these different sexual orientation categories are so important, because, and like, yeah, even like how do you present in different places? Like, I mean, we see a lot of people, they don't feel comfortable presenting as gay at work, and it's like they have a straight persona for work and a gay persona for their friends, and it's like so much nuance that it really gets missed.
I'm really curious, given that all these surveys and options and curious if and what justifications they offer as like valid survey items. And the reason I ask is I'm familiar with at least some research out of Northwestern that has like highly dubious sort of questions regarding specifically transgender identity, and how? I just have to ask how you come to those decisions.
I mean, there's a lot of people who use their own thoughts and feelings to develop survey questions and don't talk to the community to develop them. It's like these things don't go through the rounds of validation and testing that like scales for depression and things go through. So people are pretty much free to come up with whatever they want, and people replicate what they like or change, and nobody says anything because there's not a valid scale. And some of it reflects like what study you're doing. If you're doing an HIV study, you have a ton of behavior questions, but in general, it's like whatever you feel like adding. And yeah, there's a ton of terrible survey questions out there.
Question from or comment from online, and then
Sounds good.
Yeah, one thing that we got coming in from online about the importance of standardized questions is they might also serve as an accessible way to invite researchers who are unfamiliar with SOGI identity into that space. So people who have never collected SOGI data before. This person says, I find that many researchers are open to collecting the data, but don't know where to start. I think that's something we heard a lot at AEA, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people at AEA or American Evaluation Association, the Summer Institute, were like, we've never even known how to start these conversations with the funders, the community. Like, we know, like, there are lots of people in the community who identify as this. We're doing this survey on, like, cancer or smoking or whatever it might be that doesn't focus on health disparities in sexual or gender minority populations. But now that you're talking about this and presenting on it, we understand that we need to include it. And even if we're not going to look at it, someone else might, and having that data is so important. So it's a way to start the conversation. Okay. Well, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to now introduce Lauren. Let me get my ground. And so Gregory spoke a lot about data sets and measurement, and Lauren's going to shift a little bit more into ethical issues. So Lauren Beech is a research assistant professor in the Department of Medical Social Sciences in the Feinberg School of Medicine. She is the associate director of the EDIT program within the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing at Northwestern. Dr. Beech is a sexual and gender minority health researcher who aspires to advance health equity through collaborative scholarship, community engagement, advocacy, while applying an intersectional social justice-based lens. Dr. Beech completed her PhD in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology and genetics in 2014. In December 2012, she received her law degree, magna cum laude, from the University of Minnesota Law School. Dr. Beech is supported by a K-12 award from the Third Coast HIV-related cardiovascular and sleep disorders K-12 career development program. For her K-12 project Cadences HIV, she investigates social and biological mechanisms that contribute to heart failure in people living with HIV. Dr. Beech is a well-recognized LGBTQIA and bisexual community leader, among other accolades. She has been named a Point Foundation Scholar and one of the Advocate Magazine's 40 Under 40 LGBT activists in the United States. Welcome, Lauren.
Good afternoon, everybody. The microphone, is that a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Really looking forward to continuing to expand our conversation into a topic that I think that we have been dancing around and discussing in many of the presentations and conversations that we've had, but haven't necessarily directly said the word ethics. And I know that there was a mention of that there's a need for a code of data ethics when it comes to big data analyses, especially as it pertains to thinking about data equity, which is really the flip side of the hashtag for our event today, which is bias in big data. I also wanted to expressly thank the people who are online on Blue Jeans and on Twitter who are making sure this conversation goes beyond these four walls. Okay, how do I get this to? Okay, there we are. Thank you. Perfect. So this is not mine.
You know, technology.
There we are. I just went back to Gregory's slides. Perfect. Okay, so on that note, just a quick reminder about how to participate if you're remote. So you can write a comment in the public chat on our Blue Jeans. We have multiple streams for our Blue Jeans participation today. You can also send a private message to our moderator. Please, it's Follow Friday, y'all. So this is a call out. Please, if you have not already, if you're on Twitter, follow the connect _ ISGM Twitter account. We'll follow back. We're nice like that. And you can also, once we follow you back and we're connected, you can direct message on Twitter, and that's what's required to do that, to participate in the conversation that way. And then I already called out the hashtag, and then people can email us questions or comments at connect@northwestern.edu, and we especially are asking people in Evanston on the Blue Jeans link to use that method to communicate, to join the conversation. And I will have a couple of questions throughout the talk, and we will have our moderators on Blue Jeans and on Twitter post those questions so that we can have an interactive conversation across platforms to make sure all our voices are in the conversation. So.
I was going to say that she's like by far the best person on social media. She's wonderful.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I did also put out a Follow Friday tweet to follow not just the Connect Twitter account, but the speakers, people. If you're on Twitter and you look at the bias and big data hashtag, you can put that in the search portion on Twitter. All of those tweets will come up, and just follow every person tweeting right now. Just take a minute and do that. I think you'll like what happens to your Twitter feed. So, okay. So I'm going to start off more with some thinking about how data integration, to build on Gregory's comments about SGM measurement, sexual and gender minority population measurement. That's the science research term for LGBTQIA populations that gets used a lot. It's okay. Yeah. Here, I'm going to put it off there. And here we go. Also, okay, so I lost my train of thought. So we're thinking a lot about, so continuing this conversation that we're having about Gregory's content about measurement. So I'm going to talk about how data integration can be a tool to help make the invisible visible in data for sexual and gender minority populations. I'm also going to talk about the good and the bad of that fact. Because perhaps, so when we're thinking about, it depends a lot on the sources of data that we're integrating. We've talked a lot about how big data, can really be harmful in terms of bias, and specifically as it relates to systems of social power for marginalized people. Big data can have a fascist effect. It is, big data. If big data means data being held in the hands of the few, that's a data oligarchy. And that's not okay. That really negatively affects the lives of people who are, and if we're thinking about social systems and power, this has a disproportionately negative effect on people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy of social power. And so thinking about how big data and data integration sometimes isn't necessarily just something that's automatically a good thing, but that, and especially when we frame this question in terms of an ethics type of question, which was brought up, and I did tweet out the Facebook open letter because I think it does a beautiful job of capturing that. reality, like thinking about the effects of big data and data integration on public health and health policy, and also just overall governance and social power and systems. But before I get into all of that, I wanted to just give a nod. So I did Google LGBT big data before we, so that we could have something, an homage, I guess, to thinking about, Google is one of the biggest data aggregators of them all. Search engines, actually. It's not just social media and dating websites, but Google. How many times, and Bing and other search engines, Yahoo, how many people use that every single day all over the world? And all of those usage data are part of big data systems. And it's also it's the first place a lot of people look to answer questions about anything. There's even Let Me Google That For You, the website, right? To try to figure out what's going on. And so this is what happens, though. And I wanted to highlight the research results, too, because apparently the number one hit, or what people also ask is, what is the gayest city? What is the gayest country in the world? What is the statistics of homosexuality? And then actually, I think an important question, maybe an example of why this data is important when you think about social determinants and social health. What % of LGBT youth are homeless? But it doesn't bring up anything about the ethics of the conversation, what's going on, how to, what are best practices? Nothing is, that's not the top of this conversation, right? So I wanted to highlight that. Okay. So one question I just wanted to pose to the audience here, and people online as well, you can put this question into Blue Jeans into Twitter. So other than survey data, what are some sources of sexual and gender minority big data that are out there? I started with Google. We've had some other things, but I just love to hear people's popcorn style. Just shout it out.
Chicago Health Survey.
The Chicago Health Survey. Social media. Dating apps. Anything coming in off? Great. EHRs, electronic health record systems. Other sources? Social media, yep. Great. What sources, for how many people in here would say that they do research or are a researcher? We've got a few, actually a lot of people in the room here raising their hands. That's really notable. So I would ask, what sources of big data do you all use in your analyses? If you think about the context of this conversation for you, now that we've named some sources, which ones are you using?
Health Department data from Illinois to Chicago will include the census.
Great.
Census,
Health
ACS.
Department data across multiple platforms, the census.
Police department.
Sorry?
The police department.
The police department, yeah. Great.
I'm using IMDb data and just bring out even gender or something. And there is almost no information.
You said that is what?
Movie
database.
Yeah, IMDb. So if you think about film and TV, the website that collects all of that, list it. Other sources of data people are using.
Hospitalization data it has to be reported here in Chicago.
Hospitalization data and reporting here in Chicago. Great. Yep.
Well, there's the sexually transmitted diseases, reportable diseases.
Great. Reportable diseases for sexually transmitted diseases in the health department. Okay.
Social media data.
Social media data. Great.
Someone on Blue Jeans says a long time ago they used to use magazines.
Magazine subscription data from our live streams. Love it. Yeah. I think it's important that, because this has been said a couple times, because we're talking about a topic, but then that is in general just something that's important to have in society as a conversation. But for a lot of us, it's personal. And I really think, as Austin, you said, thinking about integrity and relation of this as a question to yourself. In what ways are you using data systems that in your own work, and what accountability and responsibility do you have as a person who's doing that work? Or if you're a person who's a funder, what accountability do you have in thinking about what studies you're funding and what not, and which data sets are you funding people to use, and which ones are you not funding people to use? And then also, going back to the other conversation earlier with our keynote, with Yeshi's talk, thinking about who's funding those things, who owns those data sets, and who's helping make ethical decisions about what gets published, what gets studied, and what doesn't. And this is something that's personal for people. If anyone in this room, who's using data, who's collecting data, who's disseminating data, who is engaged in processes, whether or not we call it research or not, whether we're thinking about what stories we're sharing, how we're framing things. There's a personal integrity set of questions that you should ask about values and what you're putting out in the world, and have you questioned what you're putting out? You know, who is the funder? Who is coming at deciding the questions that are asked? And also, is it a question that the community would ask about itself? Is it a question that somebody who comes from a certain lived experience would want asked about them? Do they feel captured, seen, validated by this question or not? And what data sets are you using? I will put that out there as something, and myself included. I'm also a researcher. So just to build on the conversation we were having together, some other, so this is, I thought this would happen a lot of, especially since Gregory also just gave a great talk about summarizing all our different public health surveillance data sets. I wanted to say that out loud too, because if somebody hears surveillance data, that may mean different things to different people. So I want to call out the express context that we're talking about with surveillance data. Health surveillance, surveys about health, right? Electronic medical records, which was brought up. Medical billing data sets is another type of data. So that is often, it can be collected either through the government, through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. You can get expenditures data, or it could be private. It could come from Kaiser. It could come from other large health systems. And thinking about cost data and health economics or other economic types of questions, expenditure data is something that's important to consider that's available. Social media data has been brought up. Market data also is huge. Thinking about corporations or private companies that are collecting data for marketing purposes, specifically, again, those that are going to be tied into profit and other types of systems that we've already talked about, and the motivations that those can have when you're considering what's being asked, who holds the data, and how it's used. And then program evaluation data, that's something I wanted to give a shout out to Gregory, also in the Chicago Department of Public Health, some work here in our team, and being done to evaluate HIV prevention and treatment and care programs throughout the city of Chicago. There are data sets collected through that, through either, a lot of times, those data sets are collected by community-based organizations. And so I want to also think about, you know, we have a lot of conversations about, oh, what's the quality of the data set? And maybe if the questions aren't asked in a way that fits with other standardized questions, we think, oh, that's bad quality, or it wasn't done well. But it's like, well, also, who's it coming from? And maybe that matters. And another thing that I really love about working with EDIT day to day is the fact that the team works to build evaluation capacity in community-based organizations to help democratize the sharing of these skills, to help ensure that data collection can be spread more equitably among and be put into the hands of people whose lived experiences the data is supposedly designed to benefit, but does it really? I mean, that's another conversation, a theme I've seen throughout this conversation today. And then government databases. I love that you said the police department, because yeah, the police department can be a source of data. And how do you get access to that data? Yeah. And other things, the health department, thinking about, you know, CMS already mentioned, like these are other sources that you can use to think about data. And then the other thing about these, though, is that with the exception of electronic medical records, certain systems, that's increasingly happening, that sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity are being asked in electronic medical record systems in standardized ways, or like in the actual EMR platform, there'll be questions that may or may not be filled out. And it may be filled out by a healthcare provider, a receptionist, or a patient. You just don't know sometimes. Or surveillance data. Most of these, or I suppose market data, many of these sources of data do not include sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And I know that we had a conversation about some of the trouble with the data collection, and we've had some debate about standardization, but we also started off this day by recognizing that data is power. And it's really a question of what are we doing? Like, who holds that power and how is it being used? And then how is the data being taken and used and applied to benefit people, or is it being used to benefit profits, you know? So thinking about like the actual power systems matter a lot. The other thing I wanted to say, and I didn't speak up because I thought I'm going to have my chance to talk shortly, is that I do think that there is a difference between collecting personal identity data for sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and community affiliation. Because and both of those things matter. So a lot of the federal surveillance questions, when they're asking these things, don't necessarily ask, what is your personal identity label? They'll ask, which one of these best fits you? Or which one of these, there are other prompts that really indicate to me we're asking about a community affiliation, or, because identity is relational, right?
Yes.
And so I don't think it's such a big problem in some ways, because we also know that we're stigmatized at a systems level. We're stigmatized individually, yes, and then we can have internalization of stigma, we can have individual everyday experiences of bias and discrimination that affect us, but then we're also stigmatized at the community level and at the population level. And if we're thinking about data oligarchy, we're stigmatized in terms of an ultimate power system that doesn't recognize our humanity, and that says you're less than, and it says that, your voice doesn't belong here. I'm not going to lift you up. I'm not going to see. We're literally not going to see you, because we're not even going to ask about you, because you don't matter.
Right.
And so I think that there should be, that's part of the work that I know that we're going to do together on, assuming someday one of our grants gets funded. No, I'm just kidding. That we can think about this, like, how are people answering these questions? Are they saying, I don't feel seen? Or are they saying my community isn't seen? Or are they saying both of those things? I think that distinction matters. And I think that it relates directly to how we think about health, social determinants of health at a systematic, multi-level conceptualization. So, okay, I'm done with my soapbox. All right, back to data integration here. So data integration as a sexual and gender minority big data research tool. So these are the bisexual pride colors representing 3 different data sets. Right? 3 different surveys, 3 different, could be market data, government data, a health survey. Think of whatever you'd like to, your favorite data, what data, right? And then they all are going to have some sort of identifying characteristics that a researcher or somebody doing an investigation might use to link across, as the same person in each of these 3 data sets. Maybe we have some indication that they are, and we want to figure out how to do that. So then we figure out how to do that. We link at the person level, and we're going across, or the organization level, whatever it is. It's the same entity, the same record that we're able to think that we've reliably linked. But then, so then none of these right now are depicted as necessarily having SOGI data in them. But what happens with data integration is that, so I'm calling this the rainbow connection. So there's one of these surveys that's going to have an indicator, right? One or more indicators of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. And then we're able to, if we know that in one, and all it takes is just knowing it in one, right? And so then we can go across and look in every data set. And that's power, right? That gets back to this idea of concentrating data power, the power of having big data in the hands of a few, or it could be the hands of the many. Either way, it's important to think about the fact that this can happen, right? And why is that important? Especially for thinking about sexual and gender minority populations. Well, one thing, I wanted to start with a good example, right? So one thing that's been a struggle is in terms of data systems and SOGI data capture is that we don't have good mortality data for sexual and gender minority populations. And that matters because when we're thinking about all-cause mortality, what are the leading causes of death and morbidity, in these populations, we really just don't have a good idea of that because we don't systematically track that data. But other surveys do track that data, right? So the NHANES survey, the National Health Interview Survey, thinking about you can read all those surveys up here. Like, this is off the website. I can post the link as well. But we have this ability to integrate across certain health surveys and the National Death Index now. So we can start to think about how we could track people's causes of mortality in this population in a way we couldn't do before. And that could be important for thinking about policy, right? And the other thing I wanted to say about policy and advocacy is to really echo what was said in Yesh's talk earlier, which is to say that we are those leaders. So, thinking about who is going to do this advocacy work, who's going to do data advocacy work, who's going to do public policy work, it's the people, it's us. Because who else is going to care, honestly? Who else is as invested and who else should be doing it? We don't want to put the task of advocating on behalf of social justice only on the backs of the marginalized, but we also need people who are from these, have lived experience expertise to come forward and to do that work and to take this data and to take it to Congress, right? To take it to the health department, to take it to the school systems, to take it to board meetings, to take it to the community-based organizations, to form intersectional coalitions and to take it and to share it and to disseminate it. And I actually think that sharing results of these different studies that are coming out by us for us about marginalized populations is something that's incredibly important ethically, because it takes that data and the power of data from the hands of the few into the masses and allows us from the grassroots up to say what, we need accountability, we need public policies, we need funding, we need benefits. Right. Because data without action is nothing except data oligarchy, right? If we're not taking results of this and using it to benefit the lives of people who are supposedly collecting the data to benefit in the first place, and I even said it in a weird way because then that seems like somehow scientists don't have marginalized identities or scientists don't have some sort of accountability or are from a different population. I'm a bisexual ace person, right, who is in the academy, but who came to do this work. I have a pretty weird background for what I'm talking about right now, right? But I switched my whole focus of my career to be an LGBT health researcher because I felt it was important to do this, the bias for us, and to work directly with community organizations that I've been a part of for half my life now, to give back and to say, no, this, we actually have to have change, and there's no reason to do this work without connecting it to an advocacy purpose that is directly community engaged. So that example, so I wanted to bring up, we also talked about this question but didn't directly bring it up, this idea of the closet or outing. So when we go back to the Rainbow Connection example, right? So what if the data source in the pink box here is a dating profile? And then what if the purple and blue are something like a government data set and a police data set? And then what if someone gets a hold of this data set and figures out, we already know from previous work that you can re-identify people from social media or dating profile sites. What happens then? We have a complete and total context collapse, right? So, and that means another way of thinking about that could be outing, because people do control the data privacy settings that they have in different places and shape the presence of what information is out there about them online and in public in ways that are different than what they might do in their private spheres. So this is important to think about, and I already talked about this, about discrimination, stigma. There are real social consequences, power systems, et cetera. And so then this is just another way of thinking about it. Data silos, context collapse, like we intentionally shape who does know and who doesn't know about different parts of ourselves. I wanted to really name some excellent, outstanding work by Michael DeVito, Ashley Marie Walker, and Jeremy Bernholz, also some people here in our institute, Catherine, oh my gosh, how can I say? McCapital, thank you so much, there we go. And so many people thinking about these very important questions. You can read their excellent work. But about algorithms, I think this is a case study that I'm not going to spend too much time on. I'm not sure what time it is. I know we've sort of been loose throughout the day. Sorry? 3:39. Oh, I think we're okay. I'll spend about a few more minutes, and then I wanted to have a group activity, so I'm not going to belabor this case study. But how many people saw this paper when it came out or heard about it? This paper by yes, people are shaking their heads. It's called "Deep Neural Networks Are More Accurate Than Humans at Detecting Sexual Orientation from Facial Images." This is an example of a research team that developed a deep learning algorithm to determine, to predict if there were faces, I also want to say completely white set of faces, and which ones were gay and which ones were straight, and they looked at people's dating profiles and Facebook profiles to train their algorithm. And then they published that, and so a lot of people said, yes, I'm not going to necessarily go through this conversation because I think it's obvious there are so many things wrong with what was done here. But I will just leave people with a couple of references to read through. The only thing I'm going to say is this raises the question of data privacy and ethics in some really big ways, because thinking about big data and how it gets used and how people do or don't consent with things like social media to have their data used in a research study. That's something that was already brought up earlier too. And then this is the last thing I'll say is that some people now are actually putting disclaimers in social media and dating profiles that their profile cannot be used for research studies. And this is something that people are trying to do to fight back against data oligarchy, right? And also context collapse if you're thinking about sexual and gender minority folks. And so this is an open question under what should happen. When, I think certainly if somebody says you can't use my data in a study, then you should not have their data in a study. But how do you make sure you're not doing that when you haven't thought about not doing that at all, and you are, people are doing it already, right?
Right.
So some potential solutions, and then I'm not by any means going to be the person that has these solutions. It's going to be a community of people that has these solutions, and that's what the conversation I wanted to have was with y'all. So potential solutions, nothing about us without us. How about that? Thinking about social justice 101. So engaging sexual and gender minority people, so individuals, community stakeholders, and community organizations, both are important to engage, and researchers in the design, conduct, analysis, and dissemination of sexual and gender minority big data analyses is key. Enhancing opportunities for teaching, training, and mentorship in sexual and gender minority research in a way that also lifts up sexual and gender minority people to learn about how to do this in all of those different steps, not just in terms of research, but also how do we take people to, train people in understanding like how to read a study, take the important results, and then go advocate. And how do we get people to be able to have the resources or to get them to the places where they can advocate. So that's something else. And then this is also something that's echoed in the Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office at the National Institutes of Health. There is a call for training and mentorship and teaching opportunities. And I think that also gets to the point earlier from Dylan and Rachel and Gregory's experience at the American Evaluation Association Summer Workshop. How do we do this? What do we do? So we know we have some examples of terrible things, but what are the good things? We can say that these things are important and things aren't perfect, but what do we do in the meantime? Because data is power, right? And we know that people who aren't listed, who don't have, if we don't have numbers, if we don't have, it's harder to get policymakers to listen to stories if they don't see numbers first. But then if they see numbers, then they need to hear a story. So it's kind of weird when you think about an advocacy model, but both are important. And then this is really something that I did not see your slides, but I think that there's just so much that is in common about needs of how to advance solutions. So we really do need ethical guidelines and recommendation for conducting sexual and gender minority big data analyses to be developed. And they must also include individual people and community stakeholders at the table to have equal participation and have voices be lifted up and heard in the formation of these as that process advances. And so what I really wanted to do is to get some comments, and this is going to be recorded, so it could be thinking about expanding this conversation. How could we develop we can develop a white paper or develop, a tweet paper, to actually think about what are some of these things that could turn into these recommendations? Because honestly, this group is a great place to start because there are a lot of people here who are coming to this in multiple ways. Like, I am a bisexual ace person. I am a person who runs a community organization, who's been a stakeholder for a long time, who I think also every community thing that I run, we start with history and values and safer space, right? Because that enters the conversation. And then also many people here are researchers, policymakers, funders. This is a great place to start this conversation. And so I would encourage people to, on Twitter and on Blue Jeans, and then in this room to start, if you're thinking about what would you put into a document like this? What would the ethical recommendations look like? What would be some of the shaping principles and frameworks? Maybe you can think of another model you want to shout out into the room. There's a paper that needs to be part of the background that makes this happen in terms of, in reality. What should we say about data integration, data privacy, data security, engagement? And do we want to advocate ethical review for data science? And so I'm just going to stop, and I want people to start. What are some of the things? Awesome. So we have one on Blue Jeans, so I'm going to give up the mic. I'm going to try to.
So this actually came in earlier, but it fits perfectly with this. Somebody in Blue Jeans wanted to share that they know of a set of principles for community engagement and research that were created in Canada. It's called the OCAP. I don't know if that's pronounced OCAP, but it stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. So from what I can tell, this was created by Indigenous leaders for research with the Indigenous community in Canada. And what it means is that the Indigenous community is the subject of any research, owns, controls, can access, and can possess all of the data that is collected. The person who wrote this goes on to say that these principles have a lot to say about the potential for data science inequality interacting negatively with data science movements. And for more, they did give a couple of names that I just want to direct people to. Those are Angela Mashford Pringle or Suzanne Stewart, both of which are at University of Toronto. And then Janet Smile, S-M-Y-L-L-E. That might be Smiley. I'm not really sure with the Blue Jeans font. That's at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto.
Thank you so much. What else should we be bringing to the table? Yeah.
Kind of on a related note, one thing I think about a lot, when I've worked on projects with big research, I've been part of data collection. Hey, Mark, what do you think about this? You were helped to collect or do some of these interviews. Does this insight make sense to you? And I feel like reframing or thinking about people on the ground as part of the research team and literally just bringing them into the hey, we saw this and we're thinking some of these things because like caseworker filling out thousands of forms with a ton of different people knows instantly so much more about what a particular data point might be. Who presumably, and more often than not, does not have any background in the field work. So that's something I a lot about, like, and those people literally be in more often, ever.
Great. I think that's a great point. I'm going to repeat also just for people on Blue Jeans, and I want to just pass the mic around, but maybe you can, so I think the answer here was also bringing more people to the table, especially those involved in on-the-ground work.
Yeah. Hello, people online. So I have been parts of sort of larger research teams where when I've been involved with direct data collection through interviews or helping people fill out surveys, PIs have asked me, what do I think of a particular interpretation or insight because I've been, quote, in the data. And I think it would be great if we could include some other folks who aren't researchers, who are doing field work, invite them into a room to sort of help validate some of our insights and provide insights of their own when we're looking at data and trying to understand the very people that they are working with.
I will take the microphone.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, okay. Actually, so I've been getting mixed messages, but I think I'm going to still take the mic around. So other people want to say. So I think that there's been a great start to the discussion. Other folks. Yes.
So, and excuse me if I can't get all my words out because I'm still in a thought process. But one principle that I really want to focus is that, especially for the SGM, is that I feel like a lot of researchers who I've heard really do put the intersectionality on a back burner. And so they're so concerned about, we're invisible, which I understand, and trying to get the SGM population seen, that they forget that there's a lot of intersectionality. And so the race piece, the class piece is just thrown to the back burner. And when people present, it's just like, oh, this is all we were able to get because our community is so small. And it's like 80% white and then 15%, Latinx and 5% Black. And it's like, how can you not do intersectionality? And I know people throw around our word a lot, and everybody's not doing that well, but really not only including that principle, but also knowing what to do with it and knowing how to do interaction analysis and things like that for your data. So actually carrying it through the process and not just saying it. Other folks? Yep.
I'm very loud.
Okay.
I like that slide that you show about people putting warning about what the data is. I actually read an article a while ago about talking about privacy and data and stuff. It would be nice if all of these systems that record our data also would allow us to say for what uses our data could be used, right? And it would not be assumed that we checked everything, but we would have to check for it to be actually used for something. And the other thing is sort of when someone is doing an analysis from the ethical side, it's sort of the kind of IRB questions. To in which way is the benefit to this population that I'm going to be analyzing the data, then the benefit is larger than the potential harm or nuisance that I'm causing. And I think the profit motive is so big for some of these analysis, right? It's a way to get publicity, or it's a way to so, oh, look how clever I am, I can do something. And for it's using people's data and information with potential negative consequences without a second thought to any of that. And I think that it's not only about ethics. I think there needs to be some heat at the end of that, right? That if you do something that you are not allowed, actually this is criminal, not just you are not nice.
Yeah, I think that's really important, like thinking about what are the consequences, because if you're making a policy, then you have to identify, like, how do you know if the policy is followed or not? And then if it's not followed, what it happens, what's the accountability process? So I think that would be something important to highlight. And I like that you were drawing from the institutional review board or like ethics reviews, thinking about when can you use the data, when can you not? So you have a data warehouse, when can you use it and when can you not, for what purposes? And then, yeah, I think you're right that the benefits for the risk-benefit ratio, depending on the relative position of power that someone or a particular group may have in society, may be different. And thinking about labeling, about what happens if, say, an entire community gets labeled sick, what does that mean? And when it comes to these discussions. So, and then how would we translate that into a code of ethics? And I think the IRB, and that's what researchers would start with, but then thinking, how does that also play out for tech and data science, these contexts, and how can we identify consequences and accountability measures for people who don't need to or have to submit their research to institutional review boards? Yep. Yep.
I don't mean to sound like a Republican ever. I do think there is a piece of personal responsibility where how many people in here really read of anything, right? And I think educating people on the ways in which their information can be used, right? Just making it public knowledge, and understanding the vast majority of people do not read those disclaimers, right? That even if you put those sorts of disclaimers on your Tinder profile, the likelihood that anyone in an office somewhere is going to care that you wrote that on your profile, and is not just going to call your bluff, right? That you're not actually going to sue them, is tricky. So I think making it public knowledge that when you have Facebook on your phone, right, they can access all your photos all the time, right? That sort of thing. And it's scary, unfortunately, but I think, again, the more that individual consumers know in terms of their interactions with these software companies and with these major organizations, the better off they'll be.
Great. So education as a form of, helping people become aware, because I also think more people were aware of that, we'd have different regulations. Yeah.
So I don't want to trivialize that really important point about increasing just awareness and literacy of the implications of these issues for the public. But at the same time, I think that tech companies need to be held to higher standards when it comes to even making the terms and agreements digestible, comprehensible to lay people, because it's purposefully written in such a tedious and exhausting way that the average person is not going to read 10 pages of micro-sized font. And I think there are other countries, or the European Union, who's passed really robust data protection regulations, and I don't really see the U.S. government ever doing something as close to that. But there's a role for the private sector to play in stepping up to the plate and not exploiting people's data in the way that they are. And to the previous lecture that just took place about the FACE app, a lot of people were making fun of everybody who shared that data, and I went and I did not do it, but I read the terms and agreement. It was astounding. It was about irrevocable use of your data permanently for all kinds of commercial purposes. And I mean, when I read it out loud to my colleagues, I couldn't even believe that and this app was allowed to have terms like this. And so I feel like something should be fixed on that front.
So I was thinking about in the last lecture about how it would be beneficial for the LGBTQA population to be asked questions when people are doing research data on cancer or surgeries and that kind of stuff. But and then talking about ethics here, we live in a society in the United States right now where health professionals are allowed to discriminate legally against people because of their sexual orientation. So is that really beneficial to be asking people that? Because now surgeons might be able to say, oh, you checked this, I'm not going to do the surgery on you when I have the legal backing to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Could the collection of this data have a chilling effect on benefits and services people could receive? I think a lot of health systems and hospital systems have made blanket statements. Like previous to coming here, I was at Vanderbilt, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. And the state passed something like that for mental health professionals. They can have a conscientious objection not to provide mental health care to LGBTQ people, and that became law. And then Vanderbilt issued a statement that said, we will make sure that people can access care here because that's not who we are. We're not going to allow this type of discrimination to limit healthcare access here. But then there are going to be some people who maybe aren't able to access. If you think about a rural, scenario where there are a limited number of healthcare providers, how does this affect things? But then I think it depends on the context of, you raised a surgeon. That's one thing. And then what about mental health? Where you want to talk about these things directly. And I think it's an important question. Also, it depends because I think what you can also do with that is. If people are comfortable, if they're out at all, it just takes a couple of people to publicly shame people who will not serve LGBTQ clients for that to raise the issue in a way that says it's possible, but there are consequences. And the public sphere is a system of accountability if people are able to access it is something that can also be true. But again, that has its own can of worms. Yep. And I know we are probably out of time, but I think we want to take one more, at least.
What was the last one? But okay, honey, that's what it is. But no, I really want to bring some light about when we talk about the institutional review boards, and I have sat on like 3 or 4 of them, and I do sit on the one for the Chicago Department of Public Health. I don't know what that means, but I do sit on it. But the point that I'm making is that Black people specifically, and then even like we're talking now, people of different sexual orientations are not on these boards making those types of assertions. I'm not going to say they're not on the boards. I'm saying they're not speaking up. I don't know what their sexual orientation is, but they just sit there and go along with whatever's happening. And I've actually had a trial stopped once because they weren't being very judicious toward, they were scientific, but they weren't judicious toward Black people. It's a hepatitis trial. So my point is that there are already avenues that exist for us to stop their funding. And we should go after how to stop funding or how to at least slow or make their fund, like you say, shame them. Well, shame the funders for funding them, and then they'll back up because now the funders don't want to be bust out. And we can sometimes you can do that through IRBs, as in you can't get that research passed. I don't care how much you say, because 5 or 6 people in here did not want to allow you to continue. So we've had some success, but it's not enough because I don't get enough people to want to be on an IRB. It's boring. You do have to read. You do need to. It's boring. But I also know that that's where some power is, especially if you're a researcher. You know, an IRB cannot be approved if half the team doesn't approve it. You know, approve the research, I'm sorry. So if there's some ethical issues that you have about the research, you don't want to say funding, but you know that's connected to their funding.
Thank you very much. Well, and thank you to everyone here for having an excellent conversation throughout the day and for participating so robustly. I'm looking forward to next steps from this, and for that, I will turn it over to Michelle.
So we've been having such a good conversation. We're running a little over. So what the plan is going to be for the rest of the day is we're going to start to shift to talk about training. So the first part of that, because I think this is just such an important thing that we really need to get there. The first part of that, I want to highlight one of our students who's highlighted in the program who joined us here today, Austin, to come up and talk about some of his research. Let me first, though, kind of talk about like how Austin got here. So last year, so this year, the big event that I'm focusing on as part of, my work with the Institute and the Connect program is this workshop. But last year, what I did was I was trying to think. I was also on maternity leave, and I was trying to figure out what can I do that I can actually do while I'm on maternity leave. And it was trying to do some sort of an award to award folks who are doing good work across the country, students in LGBT issues, health equity, that were somehow using data sets in an interesting way. And so we had 3 scholars. They're in our program. Let me make sure I can acknowledge everybody. Okay. So only one of them was able to join. So first of all, let me just say Andrew Young Choi, I believe, is online with us. So Andrew is a PhD candidate in counseling, clinical, and school psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Andrew's paper that won him the award was Syndemic Behavior Risk Among Bisexual Adolescents, a latent class analysis, studies the interconnected factors that contribute to the growth health disparities experienced by bisexual youth in comparison to monosexual youth. Andrew wasn't able to join. He's in Hawaii right now working and not able to get any time off. But we really appreciate his work last year and his participation today. And I also want to call out William Godell, PhD candidate in epidemiology, Brown University School of Public Health. William's paper, Predictors of User Engagement with Facebook Posts, generated by a national sample of LGBTQ community centers in the United States, couples his work as a social epidemiologist with his interest in the health of LGBTQ community. William actually was on his way with the bad weather we had in Chicago. All flights were canceled and he wasn't able to get here in time. So that's very sad. So hopefully we'll meet again in person very soon. And then the student who was able to make it is Austin, who's been great in participating today. A PhD candidate in counseling psychology, University of Albany, State University of New York. Austin's paper, Individual and Structural Predictors of HIV Testing Among Latinx, MSM, Substance Use as a Moderating Factor, explores the relationship between substance abuse and HIV testing among Latinx men who have sex with men. So I'm going to give Austin a few minutes to talk about his work.
Mr. Republic.
Mr. Republic. Oh, so this is just.
Oh, okay.
This is what you're actually.
Okay. So I'm not a Republican. I'm going to say that first. So this is my paper. I knew as I was on the plane and I made these slides, and I knew as soon as I made these slides, putting my own face on the slide was like the most obnoxious thing. But this is me and 2 of my co-authors, my 2 co-authors. This was, since it won the Connect paper competition, it was very fortunately published in AIDS Care. So I'm happy to send you a copy of the article if you're interested in reading it. Be happy to, sure. It's also available online, I believe, for free. But what the paper was essentially about, well, let me start with the motivation. So one of the things I do, I've taught about social justice issues for many years. I have a background in linguistics. My undergraduate degree is in speech-language pathology. I did my master's in mental health counseling, and I practiced as a psychotherapist in New York City with a limited license for 4 years. I'm now a PhD candidate, as Dr. Birkett mentioned. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my lenses, because I think we've sort of been talking around that a lot today, and a lot of our speakers have talked about where they're coming from in terms of their race or their background. But I identify as Arab. I'm gay. I identify as cisgender. I was assigned male at birth. That's consistent with how I feel in my body. I'm also a person who came from a very impoverished background, and I think that informs a lot of my work. When I was a psychotherapist in New York City, from 2013 through 2016 is when I moved upstate, I was very much a boots-on-the-ground activist. I worked at a homeless shelter designed for men living with severe and persistent mental illness. I worked at Harlem United, which is an organization in Upper Manhattan that's well known for its AIDS work. And I did HIV testing, STI testing, and counseling as part of my work. So my lens in approaching research is that of an interventionist, and that's where really my home is in intervention. What motivated the study is that my former advisor, his name is Frank Dillon, he's a phenomenal researcher. He's now at ASU in Arizona. He had a great grant-funded longitudinal study that investigated Latinx MSM and their HIV-related behaviors. Very comprehensive. It was an R15 grant. And he was generous with his data, as I recommend that all advisors are with their students, in letting us sort of develop and design our own research questions using his data set. So one of the pieces of this piece of research is that associating more substance use with fewer health-promoting behaviors provides a bit of an incomplete picture of the way queer life is. And this is one facet of many. But queer people, as we all know from our personal experiences and certainly from anyone who understands history, have very often felt safest in bars, in clubs, in social contexts, in private spaces where people do consume substances, be that alcohol, drugs, or whatever else. So in assuming that this link between more substance use and fewer health-promoting behaviors is true for queer populations is incomplete. And so one of the things that this study wanted to do was looking at individual and structural predictors of HIV testing and how those interact with substance use, specifically for Latinx MSM. Okay, so two of the constructs we looked at that were specific to Latinx communities are machismo and caballerismo. Machismo is a Latinx male gender norm, typically, that's associated with fewer health-promoting behaviors. Of course, it's been co-opted into English, and some of the meanings there are consistent with the original meanings in Spanish. Caballerismo is the opposite side. It's sort of the more health protective aspects of masculinity in Latinx communities. It is associated with more health promotion and more sort of empathy, connection, honesty, etc. So just a couple of interesting findings as my last slide, because I don't want to take up too much time. Only 21% of our sample reported having been tested for HIV in the previous 12 months. It was a 502 and a 502. This was explicable in part due to the sampling frame. So we did not just sample at clinics. We did not just sample at places where healthcare is provided. We sampled at bars. We sampled at clubs, at bathhouses. We sampled on online forums. We sampled on cork boards in 5 major cities where HIV is most prevalent among Latinx MSM. Also, LMSM tend to get tested for HIV less often than MSM of other groups, which is explicable for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into here. But these are a few of our findings. So LMSM who use more drugs and report more exposure to prevention programming were 2.5 times higher, had 2.5 times higher odds of having been tested for HIV in the previous year. LMSM who use more drugs and who report more sexual identity commitment, were more certain of their sexual identity, were 6.5 times higher, had 6.5 times higher odds of getting tested in the previous year. LMSM who use less alcohol and who self-identify as more homosexual on the Kinsey scale were 0.25 times, had 0.25 times higher odds. And finally, LMSM who use more alcohol and who report more access to healthcare were 2.33 times higher or more likely to have been tested in the previous year. So the study is much more comprehensive than this. This was just a light dusting of the findings. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is coming from an interventionist frame. And I think one of the things that has been tricky for me in my program is that we are in R1. I'm very proud of the institution that I belong to, and I love the research that's being conducted there. But a lot of the people there, as is true of a lot of PhD programs, for better or for worse, PhD programs don't always attract people who come from marginalized backgrounds, right? Those institutions are not always open to people who come from poverty, right? I was raised in a single-parent household, right? I identify as Arab. Never met my dad. This was not on my path in my life. And so for me, when I create research or when I develop research questions, whether I follow through on them or not, I try to think about what it was like to grow up in my situation. I try to think about what it was like when I worked with marginalized communities on a person-to-person basis at homeless shelters, right? In the homeless system, in the New York City metro area in general, right? At HIV clinics, at GMHC, at Callum Ward, et cetera. So what I want to sort of end on is saying that our identities and backgrounds matter, and that our lenses in terms of how we approach research, how we disseminate research, how we give talks like this one matter, and that I encourage everyone, to the extent that they are willing and capable, to share those parts of themselves with the people who are listening to their work, and to share it with the people who are consuming their work, because it can make a big difference. That's it.
Great. That was great. Thank you. So, one conversation I did not want to leave out was this idea of training, and people's thoughts. We're at Northwestern University. We're at a university. We have students in the room. We have students online. We have teachers in the room. We have, teachers online. All of us, I think, kind of fall into that category at some point. How do we include diverse folks in this? I want to get other people's ideas about what's worked, what hasn't worked, what suggestions people have. Ideas? Anything online?
I think being creative and
Being creative.
like
Mm-hmm.
more targeted outreach that you're getting
Mm-hmm.
and actually creating.
So, like, maybe an example would be like, you're looking for students at lots of different schools and not like the typical places, or lots of different programs, something like that.
Yeah, or like Black or Latinx,
Mm-hmm.
professional associations,
Mm-hmm.
like people. So yeah, like looking beyond just like what you already have with Northwestern, posting there for our job site.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Hmm?
How do we think more about including international diversity in this? I feel like, especially as members of American academia, there is a significant concentration of resources. And how do we make the difference between just people in American academia studying other countries versus getting resources for people to study themselves?
That's a great point. I don't know if I have any other people on that. Start here and then we'll go back.
So I think it's important for institutions to call out specifically what they value in diversity. Diversity is like a very vague term, and like I enjoy getting the invites from Northwestern every couple of months to diversity in donuts, but I don't necessarily feel like I'm told what they value in how they identify me as diverse. And I think that is something important to communicate to people, not just in attracting, but retaining. I think a lot of institutions have an even bigger problem with retaining diverse folks.
In the back. Let's start here.
I guess if we're talking about just events like this, it's helpful. Like, I just happened to find it on Eventbrite. Somebody told me about it. So that's one thing. So Eventbrite, things like that help. The second thing is like different locations. One of the things that Southsiders always complain about, like we always have to come like way down or way up north somewhere to do something. So even if it's not necessarily like in South Shore or Hyde Park, just having it a little bit closer to the South Side is helpful. Outside of events and for school, it's actually about educating gatekeepers. Like I've actually been kept out of workshops, talks, lectures, and things like that. Like before I got enrolled at Chicago for the Graduate Student at Large program, like people were like, you don't have an institutional affiliation, therefore you can't come, even though I'm specifically there and have lived experience for what's exactly being talked about. So making sure that all the gatekeepers are educated on what he was saying earlier about what the school's values are and what you're looking for in terms of like maintaining and retaining diversity.
I think sort of similarly, being really intentional about mentorship, like, and I'll kind of ground this in. So as an undergraduate and a graduate student, what really helped me was people seeing faculty members take an interest in me Not solely because I am a woman of color, but just because wanting to give me the knowledge, and I guess in that sort of vein as well, we are gatekeepers in the academy. Like, how do we kind of use that power to distribute that knowledge that we have? And so, so mentorship, thinking about, how do we actually encourage other people who don't look like us, who have different experiences, to actually who would want to see themselves in these positions.
I think this was kind of talked around. So for when you are hiring your research team or looking for new people to add to a research team, being cognizant of what the qualifications are and not always saying it has to be like a master's degree or a PhD, but saying like the experience that would make you qualified for this, and being very intentional about how the job description is written and how it is welcoming is a big part of it.
I'm gonna skip you just because Richard.
Okay, I can. I think one of the pieces, having paper competition like this, because it invites graduate students, right, who are typically very poor, right? It incentivizes hard work, it incentivizes commitment, it incentivizes follow through, and it gives them opportunities to share their work, for their work to be celebrated and to be invited to this. I don't mean that to sound as corny as it just did. That is a form of mentoring, right? That once you reach a place in your academic career where you find these types of paper competitions, host these types of events, do so, to not climb the ladder and then kick it, right? To climb the ladder and leave it there.
So 2 people have shared thoughts on blue jeans. The first person says, on the topic of opening up enrollment beyond academia, we need to reach out to community leaders to determine how to recruit community members. We have to pay them for their contributions.
Yes.
The second point that was made is actually building off some of the comments that were made about educating gatekeepers. This person strongly agrees, and they want to say that so many diversity efforts have been focused on recruiting diverse candidates instead of making sure that the environment is ready to embrace them when they arrive.
I'm just going to mentor those people. The second to last comment I wanted to also bring up, I talked to a couple of students this week, just because I'm not super connected to the graduate student experience myself, to make sure that I had some understanding. And one of the things, which was a really good idea that somebody brought up, was just being able to interrogate this idea that's very common in data science, of this idea of so much data is automatically cleaned by these services. Either folks know that they're doing it or they don't know that they're doing it. Maybe they signed up to do some sort of research task, and then a lot of data is collected through that system. Another thing you could think of would be even just how Google always asks you, is that a road sign? They're learning off of that. All of these things. These ways that our work, our labor are being used, and a lot of times it's the most marginalized folks who are the ones who are end up doing it.
I think another thing is also, when do you get people into the system, or at least get them to dream about it? And I think when we are talking about the level of PhD or later, maybe too late, because the pipeline is so weak before. And so one of the things, for instance, that we do in my lab in the summer is that we have high school students coming and doing research. We have had some interaction with Evanston Township High School and have students doing internships. And you may think, well, what is a high school student going to do this summer in a research lab? And they can do 2 things. One of them is that they can understand that this interesting career. Some of them have never been in a lab, have no idea what's going on, and they could see, oh yeah, these seem like normal people and stuff. And the other thing, and I could be part of that group of normal people. And the other thing is that you don't. I always look at it from the perspective of where the student So what is the thing that they would like to learn? And what would be something that would be useful for them to learn in order to learn that thing? And so it's kind of, it's sort of supposed to be the first step in that direction. So there is no need to, for them to have a finished product as something. And I mean, that's what they learn about research, is that it's an ongoing process, and many times it takes a lot of time. And it involves a commitment from everybody. The lab is sort of kind of mentoring and caring for the individuals, but it can be extremely rewarding. And it's I don't know how to advertise it over here. I know that coming from the South Side can be tough, but I mean, maybe there are people at the University of Chicago that could be doing this too. Maybe there are people at UIC that could be doing this too. And I'm just thinking in terms of the researchers and telling people, high school students, teachers that just contact a faculty member at some school and tell them, would you be willing to take some high school student? Because,
it's funny. Like, I think so much of this too is so what I see sometimes is like the people who've had a lot of privilege in their lives have the confidence to seek out these opportunities, and it's the folks who should be the ones who are reaching out and getting these opportunities who don't, who are so often second guessing themselves. And I feel like so often my job is just to be like, yes,
push them.
Yes,
get someone to push them.
Yes,
right. It's like,
yep. Like just go be who you already are. Just like, yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that is very funny in my case is that the students are telling me about all the classes that they have taken, and I couldn't care less. That is not the point of the summer. Yeah. I don't care what I think. It's like wherever you are, I want to work with that to get into the next step. And this is the attitude that I think is important.
Oh, I don't need the mic. It's okay. I don't want to make you walk. Yeah, the last thing I'll say is that on that note with the interns, even when we tried to hire interns for where we are, what we realized is that a lot of the kids that we wanted to come and do internships couldn't actually afford to do it. And so we had to actually do a lot of grant writing in order to get them paid, because we working for free and they can't afford to work for free. That's one thing. The second thing is that I experienced, that I know a lot of the kids that come in for us are experiencing, is like there's this math competency discrimination thing, and there's actually a lot of work to be done in social sciences or in any data science. It doesn't require you to have perfect GRE or to know, linear algebra front and back in order to do it. And if you look at the trajectory of K through 12 education, especially for African Americans in mathematics, it's not going to come close. And so being a little bit more open and offering other opportunities creatively for people who may not necessarily have the best math background to participate would open up tremendously everything in the technology and sciences.
Yeah, earlier you talked about the importance of interdisciplinary work, and I think, I was joking about Brown, and Brown has a lot of issues, but if it wasn't for open curriculum and me being able to have John Ferrario as an advisor, but then also have like an econ professor as an advisor, and then be able to take graduate level classes, like I probably wouldn't have honestly started D4BL, right? And Don, he didn't have to take on this really kind of sometimes annoying undergraduate as an advisor, right? He had graduate students that he was advising, but it was really about identifying people and making the time to mentor. And I think too, it wasn't until I left Brown that I realized not everyone is this interdisciplinary. This is actually very rare. But on the community level, it makes so much sense, right? In the real world, it makes a lot of sense. So that's why what we do, we talk a lot about breaking down these silos and dissolving silos, especially around disciplines and what are we privileging more, quantitative, qualitative, technical, non-technical. One of my co-founders, he's getting his PhD in math, pure math versus applied. There's so much stuff against applied research, so I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I feel like, so I went to U of I Urbana, and for undergrad and grad, but I started off in engineering physics for like 2 years, and I just like explored because I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I needed that, and I feel like that is so important. I feel like that is, when you're able to do that, when you're able to like catch those people who would have been lost otherwise, you know, to these other sort of careers, and you're able to get like much more creative thinking when you're able to. Anything online? Okay.
Somebody just wanted to add, to build off the interdisciplinary comments, in the tech and data science world, legitimizing alternative education routes. So for example, coding boot camps, online courses that are more accessible than traditional or formal programs is really important. And we also have somebody who wanted to return to the concept of payment and compensation and mentioned that paying grad students a living wage is necessary. This person mentions that as a single parent in a PhD program, they had months where they had to choose between feeding themselves or their child, which makes a really big difference and is a really huge burden.
Okay. I don't want to, drag us up. I'm exhausted. I think you guys are too. People online are. But I would like to just throw out one more question for you guys. What next? What ideas do you have for next with this? What do you want to see? We're also going to be doing evaluations, and so we have a paper form, I think. We're going to have a Google form that we're also going to tweet out and email out that you guys can also, continue to sort of give us ideas. But are there ideas already? Like, what was about this was good? Like, what should we continue? What next?
Well, you have like 5 questions on that one. What was about this being good was our speakers and getting to meet some of the that they're working on. That's why I'm here. Even coming from a government, I work for the health department, but that's a system. But people like me are in that system. I've been there 20 years. So what does this mean next step? Is for me is it cannot just be a one-hit quit. You did it great. You did a wonderful job, Michelle. But this cannot just be it. And I think your next steps is, the advocates in the room and the organizers in the room know that your next step is you have it, implementation. What are you going to implement and how are you going to put community back into the picture? I'm not saying that every community member needs to know how to do research and science and methodology. But they do know how to say, what's ailing and what can I do better. And I do agree to the scholar doctor here that he's going to get it right, that there is some ownership on individual, but then I love that we go to, I call it community level intervention. Chicago is 77 community areas since 1977. Y'all don't know. But I think that we have to stay fluid. We stay individual, but then we have to go back to community. And your next steps is at least benchmarking 2 or 3 other things that happen. So that, I put on it, I did it, I put it in, you all got it. Then you put the onus back on us. Okay, so what else are you going to do to help this keep sustainable?
Love it. I think we could even end there, but anything online?
Nothing online right now.
Okay.
Let's get the last word.
I just want to also just thank, this has been very quickly thrown together. And this has only been able to happen because of the team that I talked about in our slides, and our speakers, our wonderful speakers, are able to join us today. It's been pretty amazing how quickly this really blew up, and I'm really excited to see what happens next with this. So once again, let's thank our speakers. Again, give Kate, Dylan, Kate a pat on the back for all of the work that they've been doing. Thank you to everybody who's joining online and participating. It's been amazing. And we will continue to stay in touch, and this will not be the only event. We will keep going on this. So now the people here will be starting to get some, hopefully, appetizers, some beverages, a little reception, and start to get to know each other a little bit even better. So thank you, guys.
Great.